Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pakulski. The framing of this podcast is doing everything we can to help you live your greatest life in your greatest body. I literally search the world for people who have a unique perspective, who have something to contribute, maybe people who are challenging paradigms and making you think outside of the box, making you challenge the way you're currently living so that you can perhaps begin to live some semblance of your greatest life, or at least begin the journey of living your greatest life. Because the reality is every one of us, myself included, is just on a journey of trying to find our greatest life, whatever that means to you. And I hope at some point we've defined that. You've defined that for yourself. I know I'm still in the process of defining it for myself, having left my previous life of aspiring to be the greatest bodybuilder on the planet. Now it's onto many other things and how I can contribute to life. But one reality that we all face at some point or another is addiction, and myself included, no exception. Addiction to food, addiction to drugs, addiction to sex, alcohol, exercise can be an addiction. And the reality is we're all trying to escape something. We all have a feeling in our body, and we decide it's a bad feeling for whatever reason, or maybe somebody told us it's a bad feeling, and we want to run away from it. We want to chase that thing on the other side of the fence that feels better. You know, we wake up in the morning, we have this default set of feelings, whether it be anxiety in your stomach, knee pain, back pain, and we have this thing over here, as again, whatever it may be, food, drugs, sex, exercise, alcohol, that can make us feel better. So we choose to do that, obviously, right? We just want to chase pleasure and avoid pain. That's what human beings do. So we do whatever we can to avoid it, and eventually it becomes an addiction. It becomes something that we need, or at least we tell ourselves that we need to overcome these feelings we have inside of our body. Today's guest, Dr. Nicole Avena, is an expert on neurophysiology of addiction in adults, in children. She currently works at Columbia University, and I love what she has to say. She teaches us how perhaps we could begin feeding our children to avoid these types of addictions, gives us some unique perspective on comparing things like sugar and cocaine, which we've heard compared a lot in the media, and whether or not that's a relevant comparison. I hope you guys enjoyed the conversation with Dr. Nicole Avena. This took place at the Biohacker Summit in Toronto. So there may be a little bit of weird noise in the background, but hey, that adds to the character of the conversation. She's a super, super bright lady who literally travels around the world teaching people about addiction, how to overcome it, and start to understand it. And I think for each of us to understand it, I make a comment on this podcast, and I want everyone on you to acknowledge it before we even start, is unless someone else offers us another solution, we will always seek something outside of ourselves to eliminate pain, right? Nobody wants to live in pain. If you have back pain and somebody offers you a pill, you're going to take it. If you have anxiety and somebody says, hey, take this pill, it's going to go away, you're going to take it. But I want every one of us to realize that the solution doesn't have to be something outside of ourselves. Marketing has made it such, business and enterprise has made it such that the solution is always outside of ourselves. But if you look into an ancient Eastern philosophy, or any of the ancient cultures, the solution is within. The solution is inside your mind. You can create solutions to these problems in your mind. You can bring back great feelings of happiness and joy and fulfillment and achievement without ever having to experience the negative association with anxiety and fear and resentment, all these things that live inside of our bodies as feelings. I want everyone to realize your greatest opportunity is within you. And I don't want to keep preaching on you guys because I want you to enjoy this podcast, but I also want to create that framing for every one of our listeners out there who has some form of addiction or has some form of negative feelings they're trying to escape. And maybe it's something as simple as an addiction to food or exercise. But realize, guys, that if you need something, that's a problem. Even if you need exercise, if you want exercise because it makes you feel good, that's amazing. If you want food because it makes you feel good, that's amazing. But as soon as you need something and you can't control it, start looking within and start looking to your personal ability to change it. Your personal ability to change how you feel, because you can change it at any moment if you just practice. I can bring back gratitude. I can bring back joy. I can bring back achievement into my body at any instant if I practice, just like anything else. Practice and you shall achieve. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Nicole Avena. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. You can feel free to reach out to me on iTunes and leave us a review, and I do my best to get back to you guys as often as possible. Have a great day. Enjoy the show. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast. My name is Ben Pukolski, your host, as always. And today I have another amazing guest, Dr. Nicole Avena. And we are going to discuss addiction, food addiction in particular. Dr. Avena is a graduate of Columbia University. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Actually, no. I graduated from Princeton University.
Oh, wow.
Close.
And you did you currently work as... Well, you explain. I'll let you explain.
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor of neuroscience at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. And then I'm also a visiting professor at Princeton University where I teach health psychology.
Wow. So neuroscience. Tell me about your current fascination in neuroscience and currently what you teach before we bridge into what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, so I guess my interest in neuroscience started when I was in graduate school. I was at Princeton and studying for my PhD. And I started working with my advisor on, thinking about what I might do for a dissertation. And I became interested in understanding, the obesity epidemic and why, despite the fact that so many people are, given this information about how dangerous it is to be overweight and obese, it's still really hard to eat healthy. Even though there's all these diet programs out there, all this information. And so we started looking at the brain and thinking about, well, maybe there's something happening in the brain that's preventing people from eating healthy. We started looking at the modern food environment and looking at the types of foods that are available and people commonly eat. And when we started doing research on this and looking at the brains and doing studies on this, we found that many of the foods that people tend to overeat, these highly processed foods, actually can affect the brain in a way that looks like an addiction. And so we started this really to study this field of what's now become known as food addiction and trying to understand how the foods that we eat can affect the brain and how those changes in the brain that occur from constantly overeating these highly processed, highly, sugar-rich foods can in turn have an effect on the types of foods that we choose to eat. It becomes a vicious cycle.
Or is it other types of processed foods? And give me some examples if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so I think, what we're finding is that sugar certainly stands out in the forefront as, being associated with this addictive like eating. And when we first started doing this research several years ago, we focused in on sugar, in part because we were trying to be careful scientists and isolate our variables. So a lot of our early studies were looking at just simply the effects of eating too much sugar or drinking too much sugar-sweetened beverages. Mm-hmm. And I think when you look at, the composition of our modern food environment, many of the highly processed foods that are out there, foods in the grocery stores, foods that people tend to overeat, they contain a lot of added sugar.
Sure they do.
And so while I think that sugar might not be the only culprit, there's certainly lots of other ingredients. There's, lots of added salt, even added fats. Right. Processing seems to be the primary issue that's associated with addictive like eating.
Have you guys looked at all at smells, or even sounds? I'm very aware of kind of the, I don't know if it's the addictive property per se, you would know more than me, but the, if I hear a, soda can open, or if I'm walking through a place and I smell baked goods.
Oh, yeah.
Trigger, right?
Exactly.
So you guys, that's something you guys study as well?
Definitely. So those are all triggers. And what happens when, you see the emblem on a cup or you see the advertisement for a fast food restaurant, that affects your brain. It's a priming effect. And so that becomes a predictor of the food that's soon to come, right?
Yeah.
And so what happens is you have these, basically we're Pavlov's dogs. Yeah. And so you have this association that forms because you know that if you see those arches, that those French fries are not too far away if you want them. Yeah. Or if you have a certain smell, like you saying, that wafts through, the stores, you can go get that food if you want it. So what happens is just those sights and smells actually affect the brain and can release neurochemicals that prime us to then want to go ahead and, get the food.
Now, have corporations approached you? Like, you sound like the exact person I'd want to hire if I owned a corporation and wanted to manipulate people.
Yeah.
Ultimately, so I'm very aware of the idea of food chemistry and that, food scientists are being pulled into these massive corporations to go like, how can we make this more addictive? The idea of the bliss point of food, right?
Right.
Is that something that you're aware of? And that's something you guys are studying. Like, at what point do people become addicted, and how do we become more addicted, or conversely, maybe how do we become less addicted?
Yeah, so we're doing research on that. We're trying to understand now that we've, done lots of studies to sort of demonstrate that this addiction is real, and we can identify all the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders criteria for addiction when the substance of addiction is food. We've now begun to try to understand, okay, well, what is it about the foods that we eat that makes them addictive? Maybe if we lessen the sugar, if we lessen the amount that it's processed, if we change the ingredients. The idea isn't necessarily to have people stop eating all junk food. I think that there's a way we can engineer junk food to just be healthier, because it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that we have to, only eat fruits and vegetables. I think that there's a place for, treats and other types of foods like that in our diet. But I think that, I'm really interested in working with food companies to get to that point where we're not finding the bliss point.
Do they want to do that, right? Like, ultimately, industry drives the world right now.
Right.
And do people want people to eat less? Like, I'm going to think that's going to be a hard sell.
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily eating less. I think it's eating different types of foods. And so there's this movement towards health and toward, especially, like the type of work that you're doing, trying to educate people about how to live your best life, how to stay healthy, how to, stay energized as you get older. And I think that becomes the issue. And I think supply is going to dictate the demand. And so if the food companies are hearing that, yes, people are done eating these over-sugared, over-salted snack foods, they want something that's a healthier alternative, there's going to be a market for it. And I think that's really where it is.
Speaking to the addiction component of it, will we ever be at a point where people are eating less sugar and less salt and less fatty foods? Just kind of evolutionarily, we know there's that instinctual drive to eat those things.
Right.
Will we ever be able to, I don't know, but eradicate, but effectively reduce the number of people and the amount of these foods that they eat?
I think that, as you said, we're hardwired to prefer the taste of sweet. That's something that's innate. So we're not going to ever just suddenly, not want to eat sweet foods. I think that the challenge becomes the fact that so many of the convenience foods that we rely on have so much added sugars in them that we basically become unable to really run a calculation each day in terms of how much sugar we're eating. It's funny because I talk to a lot of people who, are interested in low carbohydrate or low sugar living, and I've often met many who say, oh, I don't eat any sugar. And then I say, well, let's talk about that. And you start to look at the types of foods that they're eating. And there's so many hidden sugars in the foods that people eat where they don't even realize that they're eating sugar when they're actually eating it. So I think that the challenge really becomes, understanding where the sugars are and trying to figure out ways in which people can reduce the amount of sugar that they're consuming on a daily basis. Because there are many products out there that are very high in added sugars, but then there's also many products out there that appear to be healthy, quote unquote, but they also have a fair amount of added sugar as well.
Talk to me about the neuroscience of addiction. I'm very curious as to, my brain my demographic is very highly educated. I'd love to learn a little bit about exactly what's happening in the brain. This sugar touches my tongue, or, and how you could correlate it to drug addiction.
Yeah. So we started off really just taking the research that's been done on drug addiction, knowing this long history of how drugs affect the brain, and then essentially just doing a whole bunch of experiments to see whether or not sugar could do the same thing. And so what we found was that if you overeat sugar, it affects dopamine in reward-related brain regions. And so just like when you use a drug of abuse, like for instance, cocaine or morphine or nicotine, one of the hallmarks of drugs like that is that they release dopamine in the reward system. And food can also release dopamine, but the issue with food is that typically the dopamine release you see in response to food has more to do with the novelty of a food. So the very first time you eat like a new cuisine, you want to make sure you're oriented and paying attention, because from an evolutionary standpoint, if you have a novel taste, it could potentially be deadly, right? If you taste a new food and you don't know if it's going to make you sick or not. So typically what happens is when you have a novel food, it releases dopamine, but that effect kind of goes away over time. Once your body codes it as being safe, you didn't get sick from it, then the dopamine release attenuates in response to food. But what we found in our studies is that overeating sugar repeatedly releases dopamine. So every time in our animal studies, An animal releases
So
dopamine.
the more often you do it, the more addicted
Right.
you
The
become.
more often you do it, the more it happens. And not only is it the dopamine release, but it's changes in the receptors for dopamine. It's changes in the gene expression for the receptors for dopamine. So
Really?
it's these sort of long-term changes, this cascade of changes that seems to be pretty profound. There's also changes in the opioid system. And so we have endogenous opioids in our brain that produce pleasure. And when we look at those in response to overeating sugar, we see the same types of changes in the brain that you would see in response to drugs like morphine or heroin.
So I've heard people correlate, sugar is addictive is as addictive as cocaine. Is that statement true?
I would say that's actually more addictive. The reason why I'd say sugar is more addictive is because sugar's everywhere. So
Yeah.
the chances of becoming addicted to sugar are much greater than the chances of becoming addicted to cocaine, because you don't see cocaine lying around everywhere you go.
Right, exactly.
Whereas, our access to sugar is so much greater. And I think that, again, because sugar is in so many of the foods that we consume, it's sort of hidden in so many of the foods. We're much more able to become addicted to it and much more liable to become addicted to it than we are to something like cocaine, where, there's just so much less access to it.
Do you think these large corporations I think I know the answer to this question, but are doing it on purpose? And do you think there's some moral dilemmas there that we as a society face to allow this to continue?
Yeah, I don't work for any of the large corporations, so I can't really say what people are or aren't doing. But I think that, there's probably a need to have people within these corporations take a look at the ingredients in their products and, really step back and say, well, how much of this is necessary for health versus how much of it is necessary to get people to like the taste.
Well, is health their focus or is it profit?
Exactly.
Right? For most people, when the company is public, it's bottom line.
Right.
They don't care if it's healthy.
Right.
They want you to consume more and more and more. They want you to be addicted.
Right. Well, things are going to be changing because I don't know if you've noticed, but on the nutrition facts labels lately, there's now new legislation that's put in place. Many companies have already complied, but companies now need to disclose the percent of added sugar in their food products. So you'll notice for all like fat, even for salt, all these other nutrients, we often will see a percentage value for a percentage of daily value for how much, fat is in it, or sugar, or salt, or not sugar. Sugar's the new one, but salt and other ingredients. And now it's mandated that sugar needs to be disclosed. And so a lot of companies have to wake up because you don't want to have a product, if your package of cookies says it has 300% of, the daily recommended value of sugar, a lot of people might look twice and say, hey, maybe I better not give this to my kids.
What percentage of the population do you think would look twice? And that's a completely subjective question, but really looking at what like what percentage of the population do you think would actually think twice?
Well, I think, again, it boils down to a few different things. And I'm really interested in this from the psychology side of it, because I think there are people, and we've seen this in our studies, that no matter what you tell them, they've already made the decision that they're eating unhealthy when they decide, I'm going to eat cookies or I'm going to go to a fast food restaurant. So that's why some of the work that's been done with like menu labeling in fast food restaurants, where they'll put up like, oh, that hamburger is 1,500 calories. It doesn't deter people from eating it necessarily, because before they even walk through the door, they were telling themselves like, hey, gloves are off, you can eat whatever you want today.
Yeah.
And so I think that there is sort of that mindset among some people that, if I'm going to eat cookies, I don't care how much sugar's in it because that's what I'm eating. It doesn't matter. I do think that there is a subset of the population that might look at it and say, you know what, this is a lot. If I'm going to have something with 300% of my, daily value of sugar right now, I maybe shouldn't have it again in 3 hours, and, it shouldn't be something I do throughout the day. Right. So I think, it's yet to be seen how it will affect behavior, but I do think that, just having that information out there, for some people it can be an eye-opener. Maybe not so much for adults, but I know for sure as a parent thinking about what I'm going to feed my kid, I think that that's where we might have the opportunity to have some effect, because I really think that many parents are going to think twice about some of these different food products that especially are marketed towards children when they see that they're loaded with sugar, like things that they perceive to be healthy, like breakfast cereals or even some yogurts. Many of those, a lot of parents perceive as being, healthy things to give your kid for breakfast, but meanwhile,
says healthy on the label.
It says
nutritious.
It's healthy. Yeah, it says a lot of things, but that's all subjective.
Right. So the way I frame it with people is most people are emotional eaters and they're eating to achieve a feeling. And as I sit here at rest, as I first wake up in the morning, I have this set of feelings that exist in my body. And that may be, a little bit of anxiety in my stomach. That may be a little pain in my knees, some pain in my shoulders. It's just this accumulation of feelings that exist. And if the thing that I'm going to put in my mouth can change that feeling for the positive and make me feel better, I'm always going to choose that positive result, right?
Right.
That's a very hard thing to break until people start realizing that you can change the feeling yourself.
Right.
Which is why I've become such an advocate of meditation, like the idea of bringing feelings back into your body that you've experienced before and just be able to reproduce them at will. I think that's a very powerful skill set to have.
It is.
So that you don't go chasing those external things to bring those feelings back into your body.
I think the same thing, with just like with alcohol, like people use alcohol for a lot of reasons.
To numb the feeling.
To numb the feeling, to, reduce anxiety, to, make them feel a little bit more self-assured.
Yep.
Maybe it can boost social confidence. But I think that, when people step back and realize, you know what, I can do that on my own. I can get that from other things. I see the same thing with food. It's harder.
Yeah.
It's harder, but it can be done. And, just because something's hard doesn't mean we don't do it. People don't want to always take the easy way out. I think food, it's the same thing. I think a lot of times people use food to make themselves feel better. People often use food as a reward if they, especially with their children, if, their children, did good at something or, they behaved, okay, you can have a cookie or okay, you can have dessert. And I think that kind of sends the wrong message. We don't want to tell our kids, oh yeah, you reward yourself with calories. Like you should reward yourself
So what do you do with your kids?
Well, I have 2 kids and it's a challenge because they live in the real world, right? They don't live in the bubble where I can pretend that people don't get cookies when they do a good job.
I just tape their mouth shut when they're not with me.
Yeah, there you go. I think, it comes down to, having your kids, I think, understand, and this is difficult with the young ones, but when they get a little bit older, having them understand, the power of food and how, food really shouldn't be a reward for your good behavior. It's okay to have things as a sweet treat or an occasional treat, but when it becomes an everyday occurrence, that's not a reward, that's a habit.
Yeah.
And I think teaching them the differences and how you can, get pleasure in life from other things. And I really think that it becomes a very individualized skill that you have to work with your child to try to teach them because, we're talking about different types of personalities, different sort of mindsets. And I think educating kids about the fact that, pleasure doesn't always come from food. You don't, just because everyone else is having a cupcake, you don't have to have a cupcake. You don't have to go with the crowd. I think it can really be like a learning mechanism for many things in life.
So my curiosity is very much in neuroscience. So I'm curious to know a little bit about exactly what's happening in the brain when I eat sugar. What part of my brain is being influenced, and is there a certain pathway, a certain mechanism? I know it's the dopamine, obviously, system, but is there any particular regions that are being influenced more than others?
Yeah. So essentially, when you taste sugar on your tongue, you're starting to get stimulation that's going to actually activate the brainstem first. And then that's going to send messages up to the reward regions of your brain, like the nucleus accumbens or the ventral striatum. And those are really these sort of primitive brain regions that all animals have, or most animals have, mammals, I should say. And they are our primitive mechanisms that drive our reinforcement or drive us to repeat behaviors. When things feel good, in this case taste good, then we want to have more and more and more. It's coded as something that you want to repeat the behavior. Then we get messages that get sent up to the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is really where the brakes get put on, right? So that's where, you're eating the cookies and the message gets to the prefrontal cortex, and that's where your prefrontal cortex says, you know what, you had enough cookies, stop eating them. Children have underdeveloped prefrontal cortexes. So that's why if you tell your kid, here, have some cookies, they're not going to stop when they should stop. They don't have the sort of rational capacity yet to understand that. Same with some of the lower mammals in our world. So again, that's where it becomes, so I think interesting from a neuroscience standpoint, because a lot of it has to do with brain mechanisms to try to put the brakes on behaviors that are innate and, so primitive.
Primal, yeah.
And so we have evolved this prefrontal cortex to really put the brakes on these primitive behaviors. But that connection is not always so easy to do. When you have these very powerful neurochemical processes occurring in these primitive brain regions, sometimes our prefrontal cortex gets beat up. It can't, put the brakes on. It can't really stop those behaviors. And so that's why I think it's important to, understand those connections and understand how all of these things in our environment like you were saying earlier, the images, the smells, the sounds of food all activate that primitive brain system and really prime us to then want to go and eat. So we're constantly stimulating that system.
Beautiful. So I actually was writing about this yesterday, and I'd love for you to talk about it. The idea of if I'm in a state of high sympathetic arousal, maybe I'm living in more of a limbic brain primal system. Maybe it's something that's put me there, like stress or anxiety or hunger could potentially bring me into a more limbic dominant state. I'm more likely to be reactive and just start eating things mindlessly,
Right.
rather than putting myself into this more prefrontal state where I'm
Right.
actually more responsive and I can actually think my way through it. It's pretty obvious that there's certain times when you can walk right by a Cinnabon or a McDonald's and have no issue whatsoever, versus the other times when I need to go eat this now, or like it's like a substantial resistance for me to not go do it.
Right.
Can you talk about the differences there and what's actually happening in the nervous system and the brain?
Yeah, I think a lot of those types of issues where you kind of are in this position where you feel like for some reason I'm more compelled to give in to these urges than others. I think a lot of that actually has to do with stress. And so we've studied this in our lab, looking at cortisol levels and how that can affect the brain. And we find that people are more likely to give in to these types of urges when they're under stress. And, stress doesn't always have to be a negative thing. It can be if you're stressed because you're in a good mood, because you're out shopping and having a good time with friends. Like stress, people tend to perceive stress as always being negative, but your cortisol levels can be activated just by simply being in a large group and enjoying yourself. And I often think that we conflate stress and peer pressure, right? Because both, when we're in large groups, we tend to kind of go with the group. If the group says, oh, hey, we're all going to have, a drink, or we're all getting this, and you might not even want one, but you're going to go ahead and do it anyway. So I think a lot of that sort of change from, being able to put the brakes on and resist to giving in has to do with stress levels. And also I think that focus is an important thing. When people are focused on a task, they are less likely to then give in to, some of these other distractions, if you will. And so those are the two areas that I've become really interested in thinking about in terms of ways to help people sort of navigate through these urges and through, challenges that are associated with not wanting to overeat or not wanting to give into cravings that are, not necessarily something that's calorie driven.
This segues perfectly into the other piece that you talk about, and that's the first 1,000 days of a person's life and how that could potentially set the tone for, how they're going to respond to food and react to food and choose food for the rest of their life. So I'd love for you to talk about, the genetic piece, the epigenetic piece, the habit piece, how all those things integrate into the person that someone evolves to become.
Yeah. So the first 1,000 days is really this window from conception through age 2. And there's been so much research that's focused on how what we experience during that time period can have long-term effects, not only on health outcome, but also in cognitive development, also in immune response. And so it's really become this sort of critical window that people have become interested in looking at, because we know that that's when baby is developing and brains are developing. And not only is it on a biological developmental standpoint important, but also from a psychological standpoint and even an emotional standpoint. Because if you think about it, anyone who's ever met a 2-year-old knows that they're very impressionable.
Yes.
And a lot of the behaviors that they're, coping with and learning during that time, can have a long-term impact on how they behave later on. So there's a lot of changes that occur in that first 1,000 days. Not only are they important from that, just acute developmental standpoint, but there seems to be some evidence that suggests that they carry them throughout their life.
Absolutely. So how do we eat? How do we feed our kids between, birth and
So I've been
year?
interested in this from a nutrition standpoint. So I've written a couple of books on this topic. So what to eat when you're pregnant and what to feed your baby and toddler. And
So why don't we start there then? Because that's really interesting. Like, how does that influence the person that's born, like how to eat when they're pregnant?
Yeah, so that's the thing. I think, I became interested in what to eat when you're pregnant because we were doing lab research on how food affects the brains, and we had all this mounting research about, what's happening in adults and developing this issue and, trying to understand sugar addiction. And then I got interested in, well, how do we prevent this, A, and B, where does it start? Because, at what point in life do people become addicted to sugar? And so we started doing research and did some experiments looking at diet during pregnancy. And, I think that one of the biggest issues that we face in our modern medical community is that we really don't support pregnant women in the way that we should. If you're pregnant and you go to your doctor, I guarantee they're not going to say one word to you about the types of foods you're eating. They're going to tell you not to gain too much weight.
Right.
They might give you a
Don't smoke, don't
canned
drink.
lecture about, don't do drugs, don't drink, don't, eat tuna or some,
Right.
high mercury fish. But they're not likely to tell you, what foods are beneficial to your baby and to your pregnancy,
Right.
What food,
At what
how
point
much.
in the pregnancy?
Yeah, and because
Very.
it changes. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I wanted to illustrate in the book is that over the course of the pregnancy, your nutritional needs and the baby's nutritional needs change. And so the types of foods that you should be eating or trying to focus on eating early in pregnancy are going to differ than what's needed in the third trimester or even the
Right.
second trimester.
How much do supplements play into that? So I think there's a big misunderstanding or lack of knowledge around supplements and how important they are. And from your experience and your research, how much do they play in? Because I know there's maybe a liability concern there, because I know a lot of people don't intentionally prescribe foods and supplements because, I don't want to tell someone to take fish oil and it's toxic and full of mercury and there's definitely maybe a moral or a liability concern there.
Yeah.
But from your experience and your research, how much does supplements play a role?
I think there's a big place for supplements, especially when it comes to nutrition and development, because we all want to think that, yes, if we eat perfectly, we can have a perfectly balanced nutritional composition, but it's just not possible.
Right. And we all have different genetic needs.
Exactly. Yeah. And, the way we metabolize and absorb nutrients is going to vary depending on the person. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, you'd be very hard pressed to find someone that can eat food in a way that's going to make it so that they're in a complete nutritional balance.
It's impossible.
It is. So I really think that there is a place for supplements for that reason. And again, even during pregnancy, when people are often paying more attention to what they're eating, or early in life when they're feeding their new baby, people tend to pay more attention to the types of foods they're feeding their baby. You're still not going to be able to have the variety of foods to get all those vitamins and minerals that are required to be healthy.
It's just not available, especially in North America, unless you're growing your own food with your own garden.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think there is a place for supplements. And I think it really boils down to understanding, what are you eating and what supplements might you need. During pregnancy, obviously that's going to change because early in pregnancy, certain things are more necessary than others. For instance, early in pregnancy, folic acid is important to consume because that helps with brain development and the development of the neural tube, which becomes our brain and our spinal cord. You still need folic acid throughout a pregnancy, but the amount that's needed is not the same as an early pregnancy. So there is, I think, a need to...
like first trimester kind of thing.
Exactly, exactly. And, same with other nutrients like iron, for instance. I mean, you need iron during your pregnancy. And a lot of times women, don't really feel like eating iron-rich foods. It can be hard to get, iron-rich foods into your diet, especially if you're feeling nauseous or just not in the mood to eat meats and things like that. And so in that case, a supplement might be important because you want to make sure that you have iron in your diet, because otherwise that can cause problems for you and also for the baby, because the baby gets all the iron that they're going to need for the first 6 months of their life from you, from the food that you're eating while you're pregnant. Mm-hmm. So I think that you're correct that, there is a bit of a scare around supplements, especially when it comes to pregnancy and people are worried about it. But I think there's a need for it.
Unfortunately, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, it comes down to being realistic about, unless you're sitting there, eating tons and tons of fruits and vegetables and nuts and meats.
I've tried for months and I literally trying to grow my own food or get them from farmers, and for 2 or 3 months try to eat as many diverse foods as I could, and I'm still in deficiency.
I really think that there's a need for it. And I don't think that, and again, too, people try their best to eat healthy, but there's going to be days where you're not going to get some of the things that you need. Right. And so having
a
supplement
and your stress is going to influence your body's ability to absorb and
so having a supplement on board, I think, is really a smart thing to do.
Amazing. Are there any supplements that you would recommend our listeners do consume, like obviously folate when they're first trimester? Anything else you recommend? Iron, as you say, during that pregnancy? Because who knows who's pregnant right now? But there may be some listeners who know somebody.
So vitamin D is one that most people are deficient in, and it's tough because you can't get vitamin D from natural food, right? So we get vitamin D from the sun, and we also get it from foods that are fortified with vitamin D. And so depending on, the types of food you're eating, if you're not consuming a lot of dairy, most of the foods that are fortified with vitamin D are coming from dairy products. So if you're not eating dairy, you're likely to become deficient in vitamin D. So that's something that often people need to supplement with. Mm-hmm. Another one that's important is B12. And this is, I think, important, especially during pregnancy, because
Right.
most people are deficient in B12. And a lot of times that one of the effects of that you feel is lethargy. And so, feeling tired all the time. I mean, people feel tired when they're pregnant anyway. And so having that, also be due to a B12 deficiency can be a bad thing. And so that's often something that people become deficient in, just because there aren't a ton of foods that people eat that allow us to get enough B12 in order to make us feel our best.
All right, so let's talk about the first 3 years. I'm very curious about how you recommend people eat and how we create good habits around food. I think is instrumental in success long term. As we spoke about, I'm a dad, and I'm constantly on this search to become the best dad I can possibly become. And being aware of what my kids are doing, what they're eating, what they're hearing, what other people are saying to them. I'm the most aware human parent on the planet. But that being said, I don't always have the answers. Like, an awareness is step one, but then okay, well, how do I actually create a positive framing around food? How do I not get them addicted to sugar?
Right.
How do I not make it a reward?
Yeah.
All these things I'm very curious about your perspective on food.
Yeah. So I guess I come at this from the scientist who's been doing the research, but then also as the mom, because I have 2 kids myself. And so I see sort of both sides of this. And so for me, I think that the first couple of years are very important, because that's really when you're setting the foundation for, developing a healthy relationship with food.
Yeah.
And so people who start off feeding their baby the right way, I think, can benefit long term. And so the question is, okay, well, what is the right way? And for me, the right way is based on what the research says, which is to get baby to develop a preference for vegetables. And I don't say fruits and vegetables, I say vegetables, because baby's automatically going to like fruits.
Sure.
It's not a problem to get kids to like fruits. It's the vegetables that can be the challenge. Yep. And one of the problems that we have in our modern baby food environment is that most of the baby foods that are out there on the market,
the vegetables are cut with fruit.
Yeah, they are very heavily fruited.
Yep.
And so you'll have, turkey dinner, for instance, Thanksgiving dinner in a pureed pouch, and it's mostly apples, and maybe a teeny bit of turkey and a little bit of vegetables.
They got to be doing it on purpose, right? They want the kids to be addicted to sugar.
I think it's because if you take a baby and they do these tests and, these focus groups, and of course, the more sugar it has in it, the more the baby's going to like it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why it's important to start off with giving your baby, if you're going to give them a blend or give them, purees, to start off with something that is very heavily vegetable based or even meat based. I mean, just to have something aside from the fruit. I'm not saying that there's no place for fruit, but fruit should become the dessert of your baby's diet.
Right.
And I think that's really the key. A lot of parents are very focused in the first 6 months of feeding their baby on making sure the baby gets enough food. And, did he eat enough? Did he eat enough? You actually don't need to worry about it, because the food in the first year of life, all the nutrition that your baby gets in that first year of life should be coming from either breast milk or baby formula. Food is actually really just for fun, if you could think of it that way. Because the nutrition that they're getting is going to be coming from the formula or their breast milk. What you're feeding them is really about not so much getting them the calories, but getting them to like the taste of these certain types of foods and to accept them and to try them and to have a variety of tastes available to them. And I think that's really key.
Having been there, I know exactly what most parents think, right? It's like you give a baby something once, they throw it on the floor.
Right.
They don't want to try it. They spit it out. They cry.
Yeah.
As a parent, you're so eager to gosh, I just want my baby to smile and be happy, because it brings you joy. When your baby's crying, it brings you anxiety. Right. And I get it. It's just easy to give them something that they're going to really love and have a big smile on their face. But it's important to know that for that first year, it's not about them being satiated or fulfilled from that food. It's about developing habits. That in itself is worth its weight in gold.
Yeah.
Right?
And what the research has shown, there's been studies done in baby labs that actually demonstrate this, that, like you said, one of the biggest things parents do is you try a food once and then the baby doesn't like it. And then you say, okay, forget it. We're never trying that food again. That's actually the worst thing you could do. There's been research studies that show that 8 to 10 exposures to the same food will encourage the baby to then like it. Yep. So it's not so much that, I'm not saying you feed your crying baby food. Obviously, if your baby's crying or upset, you don't feed them, but don't be afraid to go back to that food the next day or the next meal and say, hey, want to try it again, because repetition seems to promote acceptance of these foods. And that's been shown, like I said, in laboratory studies to be effective.
I think that's true. A child of any age. My kids are older now, and the first time they try it, they're like, it's gross.
Right.
And then now it's their favorite food, right?
Right. Well, I think that too. I see this with my older daughter who's 10. There's a difference between it's gross and it's different.
Yeah.
Right. And
But
so a
they
lot
don't
of
know the
times
difference.
kids don't know the difference. And
Right.
so their like lexicon is such that, oh, this is different. So therefore it's gross. That's the word I'm going to use.
Yeah.
But it's actually that, they have to take some time to think about it and develop an acceptance for it and say, you know what, I actually did like that. And so coming back to these foods that maybe kids don't love the first time over and over again, I think is very important. And it's not, again, about forcing kids to eat anything. It's really just about saying, just try it again, try it again, try it again, because you might like it better the second or the third or the fourth
Right.
time you
I
taste
love
it.
creating that framing for them too, because they can't differentiate gross and different. Like no, it's not gross, it's different, and allowing them to create that terminology, because ultimately they're just putting it under this big box of, oh, that doesn't taste the same as sugar,
Right.
therefore it's gross. Well, no,
Right.
it's not gross. It just doesn't taste like sugar. And if you can give them that framing, now maybe you're empowering them with the ability to make that distinction, right?
Right.
Because if they just frame it as gross, then it just goes into this big box over here as like, oh, it's not donuts.
Right.
So
yeah, and again, you have to really develop, I think, strategies that match your child's developmental standpoint, right? So, like with little kids, it becomes more, you trying to just really push those healthier foods on them. But when your kids get older, like the preteen or even like younger elementary school age, that's when I think it's important to start having them be in charge of what they're eating and really trying to teach them the tools that they need to make good health decisions. So one of the things I've been doing with my older daughter lately, the past year or two, is when I pack her lunch, she has, a variety of things in her lunchbox. And I've been trying to teach her that, your lunch is for your nutrition and your nourishment to get you till the end of the school day. And so when you're going to decide what you're going to eat, you need to place the foods in the order of the healthiest to the least healthiest. And you start off with the healthiest and you keep eating. And then if you get to the end of the meal and you're still hungry, then you can have, the little snack that's in
that's
there.
great.
Because if you just leave it up to the kids, they're going to stick with the cookies first.
Always.
And then, you're going to get like the food that you intended them to eat first to
Right.
be, sent home
Or
or
they
thrown
get
in the trash.
distracted, or they don't want to eat
Yeah.
anymore. Yeah.
So I think kind of, giving them the tools and the sort of mindset to really think about,
I'm going to steal that, by the way.
Yeah, please do. Yeah. But I think it's been working. And I think it's something that, helps them to think about it. And I think adults, it's a good practice too. Like when if you're at a buffet and you're deciding, okay, what am I going to eat? And you might see something like, oh, I bread pudding or something delicious that you're like, yeah, I'd love to have that. Okay, have
Just
it.
start there.
But let's not start there. Let's end there and start off with the salad and the things that maybe are not going to be the most highly palatable. But let's eventually get to that once we're making sure we have enough of the good, healthy foods on our plate.
Awesome. I'd love to talk a little bit about strategies, if you have any, for overcoming addiction to food, because, as we talked about, I'm living that right now, and I'm happy to share that with the listeners. And I don't know if it's an addiction as much, but certainly a ritual and a habit of being a professional bodybuilder for 20 years and having to eat, incessantly, effectively, to as much as I possibly could. Otherwise, I wasn't growing enough. And now, even though I eat much less, whereas previously it would have been 6 or 7 times a day, now it's 2 times a day. It's still more than I probably needed a meal. And I just have this habit of, like, if it's on my plate, I eat it, or like my plate is obviously too full sometimes. It's great foods that I only eat healthy foods, and I seldom make poor choices. But it's still like eating too much, because I just have that habit of, once I begin, I have to eat to satiation.
Right.
And I've learned, strategies. I start with a massive bowl of vegetables first, and I'll have my protein second, and then maybe if there's some carbohydrate, usually not, because I'm doing ketogenic dieting most of the time, but then the leftover foods kind of fill the space.
Right.
But you can eat a lot of nuts, a lot of calories from nuts by accident if you're still hungry.
Right.
Which is usually my Achilles heel. But some strategies to start overcoming that.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to trying to, well, in your case, a lot of it has to do with portions, right? And so we developed this mindset around our portion sizes. And I think this is a large part why so many people in America have a hard time controlling their food intake, because our portion sizes have gone up dramatically from the 1950s, when we first started to see this sort of uptick in the obesity epidemic. And so the portion size, the portion that's put in front of you is what you think you're supposed to eat. So if you go to a restaurant and they put a plate of fruit in front of you, you don't think, oh, I'm supposed to take half of this home. This is enough for 3 people. You think, oh, this is my plate of food. I'm going to eat all of this. And so I think that's the big issue, is really cutting back on portion size, is the amount that is put in front of you. And that really can, help to reduce how much you're actually eating, because what you see in front of you is just mentally going to, be translated into the message of, oh, this is my portion. This is what I'm supposed to eat. I'm
very curious. This actually just segues into your framing for your children around eating what's on their plate. So I know I grew up, it was like, you got to finish everything that's on your plate, otherwise you're not allowed to leave the table. And I still do it with my kids, unfortunately. Not entirely, but I'm pretty adamant about them eating like the healthy stuff. You must finish that if you're going to have your whatever afterwards. How do you approach that? Like, because as an adult, if you've been taught that as a kid, you're probably going to fulfill that as an adult, meaning like if it's on your plate, you're going to eat it. And oftentimes that's too much.
Right.
Do you have a strategy for that?
Yeah, I tend to take the strategy of, not encouraging kids that they have to clear their plate, because I do think that, it's really hard when especially if you are in a state of hunger, when you're filling your plate with food, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be hungry at the end of the meal to the point where you're going to have to finish all of that food. But I think, with kids, it becomes tricky because typically kids are rushing to finish a meal because then they want dessert or they want their sweet treat or something like that. So I've kind of developed the mindset, and we've begun teaching our kids that, if you take a plate of food, take what you're going to eat, take what you feel hungry for. You can always take more. And so that way it doesn't become an issue of like leaving half a plate of food. I also think it's important to teach kids too that, if you take a plate of food and then you suddenly are full and, you've had enough, 5 minutes later, if you're hungry again, it's not time for dessert. It's time to go back and finish that plate of food. Right. And so, we do a lot of, dinner number 2 in our house where if, we ate at 5:30 and now it's 6:30 and you're still hungry or suddenly hungry again, it's not time for dessert. It's time to finish your dinner. And then if you're still hungry, you can have dessert. Mm-hmm. And so that's really the strategy that we've adopted. And again, it changes, and it's funny to see how it changes between children and over time as their appetites change, as kids develop bigger appetites as they get older, they have growth spurts, and also, as they get more active in sports and things like that, all these things kind of change. So you sort of need to just kind of roll with it and develop new strategies as things change over time.
Awesome. Dr. Nicole, what are you most excited about right now in neuroscience as it applies to addiction and food?
Yeah, I guess I'm really interested in this whole idea of food as preventative medicine. This is not really new. It's been around for a long time, but I feel like more and more people are actually listening to the idea and getting away from, treating diseases and more along the lines of preventing them from happening. And I think the younger we can start this idea, the better. I think, there really needs to be more efforts in the school systems to, educate kids about the importance of eating healthy. And I think that that's something that I'm really passionate about, and working with different school districts and different organizations to try to get that message to the young people, because, we're facing this epidemic of obesity that's not going to go away. And if we have a whole bunch of children that are raised and, living in school systems that promote sugar-rich foods and overeating of these types of foods, that's only going to perpetuate the problem. It's going to be very difficult to take a bunch of 18-year-olds that are addicted to sugar because they've had it their whole life and now suddenly tell them to stop. And so I think preventing this from happening before it even starts is really, something that we should strive to do.
My belief is the only way you're going to make it go away is if you introduce a different coping mechanism. So everyone's stressed. Yeah. Everyone gets into a state of overwhelm, anxiety, fear, whatever it is, that feeling that exists in their body, and they're looking for something to cope. Mm-hmm. And so some people choose alcohol, some people choose drugs, some people choose food, and unless you can give them an internal coping mechanism, you're never going to overcome it. It's literally an impossibility, no matter what they're addicted to. If it's sugar right now and they decide, okay, I'm going to stop eating sugar, it's going to become something else. Right. Because they still need to change their state. Yeah. So that's kind of what my focus has been with my demographic, is just introducing the idea of like, hey, the answer is inside you. The answer is you can create happiness, you can create fulfillment, you can create achievement in your mind, and then just introduce it into your body. You don't need those things outside of you. Sex, alcohol, drugs. You don't need those things to make you feel good. You can have them, but you don't need them. Right. And that's an important thing I think people need to realize is until you develop an effective and efficient coping mechanism for people, I don't think you ever change addiction. It's just way too deep ingrained in somebody's psychology that if I feel bad, I don't want to feel bad right now. Right. How quickly can I get rid of this feeling? So if I can learn to sit with it for a minute and then maybe move it and spin it and create a different feeling inside myself, maybe I recreate a memory of joy or achievement or happiness. Yeah. Oh gosh, now I feel better and it's gone. And I think until we do that, the likelihood of changing addiction is very, very far-fetched. I agree. I think it's really just basically the fight or flight response. I mean, if you're not feeling good, you're going to want to get out of that situation. And so people turn to whatever the addictive substance might be to get away from it. But as the psychologist, one thing I come back to is
what is the cause of the anxiety, the fear? And I think it's important for people to sometimes, in addition to developing other coping mechanisms, to actually do a reassessment and say, well, why am I anxious? Is this something really to be anxious about?
Right.
Am I anxious about something that might not even happen? Because a lot of times people's anxieties are, fears that they develop about things that may or may not happen in the future, and
Right.
worrying about, how's my boss going to react when I tell them that I need off, or, how did my husband or wife feel about the fact that I, snapped at them this morning before I left the house.
Right.
And, a lot of these anxieties are in many ways things that are not necessary in life. And so I think that's an important thing to reflect on, whether or not it's something that truly should be causing us anxiety, and to really just reassess it, because often it's the case that these aren't things that we should have to worry about or be anxious about.
I frame it as an awareness, and I do this with my kids too. I was like, hey, that feeling is making you aware that you need to do something about this. As it gets bigger, guess what? That just means that's going to be a bigger problem.
Right.
So be grateful for that. Say thank you for this awareness, and now let's use that to propel action to go do something. That's literally all it is, right? It's a feeling in our body that we've put a label on that says it's good or bad, which it's not. It's just a thing. It's just an awareness. So if I can use that awareness to make a change or propel action, then that's amazing. I should be very grateful for that. And as soon as we can frame our brain around that, all of a sudden now we have the opportunity to change. You have to. I think that's where starting with kids is important, because kids feel pain and they think it's bad. Kids feel fear and they think it's bad. And I'm like, no, it's not bad. It's an awareness. Say thank you for that. And then you can decide consciously if you're going to do this thing or you're not going to do this thing, but then it's your conscious decision rather than just a reactive, monkey brain, limbic brain kind of thing.
Yeah, and getting more information about the situation too. And I think that it's true. If you're feeling anxious or feeling fear, that is a prompt to then, like you said, take an action, or sometimes that action is just finding out more information. Is this really something fear-worthy or anxiety-worthy? Yeah.
Absolutely awesome. Dr. Nicole, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you.
Where can people find more about you?
Yeah, so on my website, www.drnicoleavena.com, that has links to my books, all the articles and stories about our research. All of our publications are on the website, so definitely check it out. And also has links to upcoming events and different places I'll be speaking at in the next few months.
Thank you so much for your time. I love your information. I'm truly grateful for you being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Nicole.
Join us on benpokulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.